Okay, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Arl Lamel. I'm a senior analyst at CSA Research, and today I'm going to be talking to you about augmented translation, which is a new approach to using the power of machine learning and other technologies to empower human linguists and make translation more efficient. I'd like to thank Lionbridge for hosting me in this presentation, which is based on CSA Research's observations of trends in the language services industry, based on our interactions with hundreds of LSPs, that's language service providers, and buyers of language services. Think of today's presentation as a combination view of cutting-edge technology that LSPs are deploying today and where the technology will be taking us in the near future. As we go along, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them. Becky Wilkie from Lionbridge will be monitoring that and will interrupt me if anything needs to be answered in the moment to clarify a point. Otherwise, she'll collect your questions and ask them at the end. So feel free to think of anything, to disagree with me. I especially like questions where people disagree. So feel free to ask the tough questions. I'll start out today by talking about why it's time for a change for language services and why they need to be re-envisioned and made over. Then I'll be talking about 7 technologies that are undergoing dramatic changes right now and that will usher in a new way of carrying out translation and doing business that we call augmented translation. After that, I'll dive in a little bit more into the specific role of MT before moving on to a slide of conclusions and time for questions. And again, feel free to put questions in the chat so that we can come back to them. Before moving on, I have just a few words about CSA Research. We're an independent market research firm that specializes in primary research about the language industry. By independent, we mean that we never carry out pay-for-play research. That means that you always get our recommendations unbiased by consideration of payment or who they're about. We focus on 5 constituencies, as you see on screen. We work first with the organizations that create content and buy language services. We work to understand their needs and in turn assist them in elevating language needs within the organization. Second, we work extensively with language service providers such as Lionbridge to research the trends, technologies, and factors that affect them and their clients. We also examine developers of language technologies, such as the technologies I'll be talking about today. And we also then work with freelance linguists, whom we regularly survey to understand how these trends affect them. And finally, we work with global consumers, the actual people who buy products and services in local languages. For instance, we recently completed a global survey of over 32,000 global consumers in 29 markets. And after controlling for quality and other things, we ended up with 8,700 that we used to examine the buyer preferences across markets. So with that, let's dive right into our topic. The first section, Extreme Makeover, Language Services Edition. For those of you who haven't seen it, Extreme Makeover is a series of TV shows where people take kind of junky houses or other things and remake them into something new. And part of our argument at CSA Research is that the language services industry is in the midst of such an extreme makeover right now that's going to radically transform it. I start this section with 2 images from the automotive industry. The one that you see on screen right now is a mid-century automotive assembly line. And that represented a major transformation in manufacturing. With Henry Ford's large-scale deployment of this approach, manufacturing went from a craft-scale activity in which small teams worked on bespoke automobiles that were prohibitively expensive to one in which specialists made and assembled automobiles in large teams. As they moved along from team to team, each team added some component. This brought the cost of automobiles down by orders of magnitude and made them affordable for common people. However, as you can see from the picture on screen, people were still involved, such as the gentleman on the left who seems to be polishing something, and then the one who's checking the door fitting. So humans were still involved in repetitive, fairly low-value tasks. Now, by contrast, the current manufacturing line shown on the right is far more automated and capable of producing more sophisticated and functional automobiles in a shorter period of time. Although, as we've seen, even this can be derailed by things such as the global shortage of semiconductors caused by bad weather in Texas in this last winter. But note what you don't see in this picture. You don't see any humans right there on the assembly line. But despite this, plenty of humans are involved in the automotive industry, in design, engineering, troubleshooting, maintenance, and a host of other tasks. As the auto industry has grown, workers that formerly were responsible for hitting rivets have moved on to much more high-value tasks. And for reasons we'll explore later, the translation industry has to make a similar transformation. Humans who see their primary job as moving from words from one language to another will not be able to keep up with the demand that we see, and much less the demand that's coming down the pipeline. So they have to evolve from into operators of complex systems that do more and that add more value to their jobs by leveraging the power of machines. So the evolution of the language industry for the past 25 years has had something of a mixed record in this regard. Many linguists have felt that it has taken away from their autonomy and their ability to work. And this trend has only accelerated as machine translation, or MT, has gone from a big business solution to a mainstream technology in just a few years. What we've seen is the development of a linear process that's shown in a simplified form in the image at right that pushes linguists to the end of the chain and deprives them of control. In a typical what's called post-editing workflow, a customer submits content to an LSP who runs it through a machine translation system and then passes the results, good, bad, or ugly, onto a post-editor. That's a linguist who has to then somehow make sense of this, clean it up, and make it into something that somehow approximates human translation and send it back to the client. In this approach, the linguist has little or no way to improve the system except through periodic retraining of the machine translation engines, which means that they're unlikely to see improvement over the short run. Now, this can be improved if translation memory is integrated, but it still leaves the linguist largely at the mercy of the technology. And if the technology doesn't work, they can have a terrible time with it. And as a result, these processes have large excesses of avoidable manual work and waste, or MUDA as it is known in lean manufacturing. So let's try and calculate just how much waste might be in this. We don't know exactly, but let's start with a fairly typical breakdown of where spending with an LSP goes. Typically, about half of what a client spends with an LSP is passed on to linguists, either directly or through an additional layer of LSPs. But for simplicity, we're sticking just with the basic scenario here. Of what stays with the LSP, the bulk is actually spent on overhead, admin, project management, and many other tasks that are essential to running a business, and a smaller portion goes towards profit, much of which is usually reinvested to improve the company. But now let's move on and look at what translators themselves do. An examination of their time shows actually a similar breakdown. They spend about half of their own time in administrative tasks, such as billing their clients, logging into and out of LSP portals, sending emails, and communicating with their clients and marketing themselves. Of the remaining half, a significant portion is spent on research, such as looking for translations of new terms, learning about technical subjects they'll translate about, finding official translations of content they must refer to, and similar tasks. And these tasks often interrupt the translation flow because they mean somebody has to stop, open a browser, do a Google search for something, maybe wade through 10 or 15 search results until they find what they need. Then they have to go back, get back into the flow, only to be interrupted maybe 10 minutes later by something similar. Now, if we expand this view into a combined one, what we see is that only a small portion of client spending typically is spent in translation itself. In this case, it's 15%. It could be more or less depending on the situation, but 15% is probably about typical. And of course, as a buyer of translation services, this is what they're looking for, but it's the small portion. And it also means that trying to squeeze fractional sense out of a word doesn't get anywhere, because the cost isn't in the fractional sense of words, it's in the overhead and admin. And these are areas where technology can help make a significant cost savings. If you can reduce the amount of admin and overhead and reduce the need for research, you can make translators much more efficient. Now, the corollary of this is that linguists never have enough time to do the work they're paid to do, because they're spending it on so many other things. And the advent of agile processes and now continuous localization increases the stress, because each project, and I put that in quotes, each project, whether it's 50 words or 5,000, has a certain fixed cost. And this tends to increase the amount of admin work. So that picture I showed in the previous slide is getting worse over time for the industry as a whole. Now, some LSPs that have done detailed studies of their workforce have found that they frequently end up using half of project time before the linguist even sees the content. And that means they have little time to do proper work. This in turn can lead to poor quality output simply because the linguists never have a chance to spend the time they need to with the content. And this also means that some of the most talented linguists are dropping out of the field at a time when more and more linguists are actually required, setting the stage for a long-term crisis if technology cannot serve to their benefit. At the same time, machine translation is becoming ubiquitous, and the challenge the industry faces will be how to integrate it with human services. In our discussions with providers of cloud-based translation management systems, or TMSs, we found that 2020 marked a turning point when the majority of projects administered in those systems used machine translation for the first time. We've had more recent surveys with LSPs that find that the overall level may not be that high, but the largest projects are increasingly carried out with machine translation. And it's clear that pure human translation, represented by the red area, is going to go down over time. Pure here means unaided by machine translation. We'll see some increase in spoken language services, but overall, things that are carried out just by humans with minimal technology aids are going into a long-term decline. Traditional post-editing services, as I described earlier, are increasing right now, but eventually they're going to go into a decline as well. So where will continued growth in the industry come from? It's from services that really combine human and machine services. The augmented translation I'm talking about today. Some of these services may seem new, may actually even seem controversial for a time, but within just a few years, they're going to be considered translation. And this is simply where the industry's heading. So now let's look at the 7 technologies that are transforming the language industry in this paradigm. Some of them are well established, but evolving rapidly, and others are truly new. In the diagram you see on screen, we have 5 technologies arranged around a linguist. And this is very deliberately done, putting the linguist in the center, because the linguist controls these technologies and is free to use them or ignore them as needed. And I'm going to go through these technologies one by one. I should also mention that if you look in the graphic, you can see 2 other technologies that are written in sort of as behind the scenes, and we'll come to those as well. Before I talk about the technologies, I'll just say a few words about the ideal customer here. In traditional localization, buyers of translation often do a lot of work in terms of file prep, communication, sending things on, maybe doing review after the fact. But in the augmented translation world, the ideal customer is one that has existing resources and works in a technical field and that can build connections that can be automated so that content can simply flow without the need for manual work. Augmented translation, as I describe it today, works best for technical content, but offers advantages for other kinds of content, such as marketing as well. The first technology that I want to emphasize is what's called lights out project management. Lights out project management is a touchless system for routing jobs to the appropriate resources. If you think about traditional language services, often it involves sending a project to a project manager who opens it up, looks at it, says, oh, I know who would be the best person for this, sends an email, checks availability, or maybe if they're a bit more sophisticated, has a vendor platform, sends it out, and finds somebody who can do this. Now, large LSPs like Lionbridge have considerably more sophisticated approaches and are doing what's called lights out project management. In this approach, it reduces the touch points where project managers have to interact with content by automatically routing content to the right person. This could involve checking availability, seeing who's done a good job on similar projects in the past, and a variety of concerns. The newer versions require machine learning about content and linguists so that the jobs can go to the right person at the right time. And these systems also, by monitoring performance, can find problems and address them proactively before they create a crisis. For example, they might monitor and say, oh, this translator into German is behind schedule. We need to bring another resource to bear, rather than waiting for the deadline when suddenly the content isn't delivered. So this increases responsiveness for LSPs to their clients and frees up project managers to focus on things that need their attention, such as building relationships and dealing with the crises that do occasionally pop up. The second technology is a reboot or revamping of current terminology management technology. Terminology management, which has long been neglected by many organizations, is evolving away from top-down control of terms. If you think of it, organizations would say, these are the words we use, these are how they're defined, here are the translations, and they declare them, push them out. But the new wave is terminology discovery, which is the ability of systems to go out and find how people use language in the wild and feed that back into the corporate processes that create that top-down terminology management. The advantage here for companies is that they're able to discover how their customers are already talking about things. So if they need to add a language such as Swahili, they could go and find out how people in Swahili may already be talking about their products and find the appropriate terms. Another big shift is that terminology management is moving away from addressing just words and short concepts to addressing micro-content. Micro-content is everything from branding slogans to multi-page legal notices that should be treated as a unit. And it's better to treat them outside of translation memory because they're invariant and you want to assign metadata, that is information about them, to this content. That metadata could be information on what products it applies to, who uses it, and other things. The next technology is one that, unfortunately, I have to say, it's hard to find a lot of examples for because it's not widely deployed. It's called automated content enrichment. This is a technology that parses content and looks for what are called entities. These are known items in the content that can be tied to specific meanings. Now, you may say that sounds a lot like terms, but it goes beyond terms. It could be things like dates. It could be names of individuals. It could be information about processes. Anything that can be identified and given a specific meaning can be identified. And this is best when it's tied into systems of corporate knowledge, like a knowledge management system or a product information management system, or even an ERP system. These are all examples of things that have authoritative information that you may want to tie in content to. And so that's an important example. Now, for an example of how this might work, I'll take a general one. If you saw a text that said, in German, that used the word Faust, which means a fist, an automated content enrichment or ACE system would be able to look at it and say, well, given the context, this probably refers actually to the famous book by the author Goethe. And so it's going to then automatically say the translation of this should be Faust in English rather than fist. Another more complex example would be if you were translating legal materials and you came across a reference to a law, say that the text is in English and you need to translate it into French. You might have to stop, traditionally, go and find that law, try and find the official title of it. But in an ACE-enabled system, that information would be preemptively loaded into your translation environment and provided to you. So the moment you see that law, it would become a clickable link. It could load the text. It could load the official translation of the title, all to save the translator from having to do this research. So ACE really addresses that research component I mentioned earlier. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, there's very few implementations today. This technology, for whatever reason, seems to be hard to convey to people and make them understand, but it offers tremendous advantages for organizations that can deploy it. The next technology is adaptive neural machine translation. This is machine translation that learns from linguists upon regular retraining after quality processes. This is actually ideally done in real time, although even if it's something that's done in hourly or something, it offers tremendous advantages. This means when it's applied that if a translator corrects something from machine translation, 5 minutes or an hour later, when somebody encounters something similar, it's already learned and fixed it so that it's automatically evolving rapidly to provide better input. And this can save a lot of time for translators. Some early deployments of this technology have indicated that some translators become as much as 200 to 300% more effective when they use this, because the MT combined with translation memory is able to more effectively leverage what they've already done and frees them up to focus on interesting and new things that require their attention. Now, this requires pervasive use of machine translation within that translation environment. Another technology I'm going to come back to is quality estimation, but this is very important here. I'll just mention it and then I'll deal more with it in a little bit. Okay, and this ties closely with translation memory. The next technology then, as I just mentioned, is translation memory. Translation memory for years has seemingly remained largely unchanged. It checks to see if things have been translated, and then if they have, it provides them back, and it handles fuzzy matches and the other things that if you work in this industry, you know about. But the next generation increasingly is working at the sub-segment level. That means it's looking at clauses, phrases, smaller portions where often the leverage can be quite a bit higher than at the whole sentence level. It's also engaging in what's known as shallow parsing, which is looking for dates, numbers, other things that can be automatically updated, even if they've changed in the source, without having to involve the translator. This technology sounds like it's blending with machine translation, and in fact, one of our long-term predictions is that maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, translation memory and machine translation really are going to functionally merge. We're not there yet. They remain separate, but over time, they're going to draw closer. And with this, artificial intelligence is driving automated cleanup of translation memories, identification of problematic segments, selection of the best matches, and other things that make translation memory more effective. And that merging with MT is because there's a shared pool of data. Now we turn to one of the two underlying technologies that go behind all this that I mentioned, and that's translation management systems. All the large LSPs are already doing what I'm going to be talking about to some extent. And a lot of the TMS developers are building these components in for smaller LSPs as well. In this view, the translation management system isn't just about pushing projects from point A to point B, but it's about choreographing all the data flows between the technologies so that each technology has exactly what it needs when it needs it in order to provide to the linguist what is required. They also handle activity tracking, financials and billing, tool and technology, resource selection, all those things that add up to that 50% of what a translator is doing that's admin and overhead. Ideally, that should be greatly reduced through good use of translation management systems. And in effect, what happens is the TMS becomes the translation company's operating system. Everything runs through it. Now, the next technology I mentioned earlier was quality estimation. If you haven't heard of this yet, don't worry. It's something that's really only a few years old. But quality estimation is a system that provides an independent, automatic prediction for whether content is fit for purpose. A lot of machine translation systems in the past would provide what was called a confidence score. A confidence score is the system's own estimation of how well it's done. But the problem is, particularly with neural machine translation, it's often the case that when it's the most wrong, it's the most confident that it's right. And that's something that can't be eliminated from the systems. Quality estimation is an independent system that applies looking at typical good translations of an organization's content to try and spot examples that will be good or bad because they're similar to what it's already seen before. And again, it's important that it's independent. This then can guide linguists to focus on segments where problems are likely to occur rather than requiring them to read everything and try and see where problems are. It can focus their efforts and also steer them away from spending time on things where they aren't needed. Now, again, as with ACE, there's relatively few commercial implementations, but there are increasing numbers. And for those who are interested, there's an open source one called Quest++ from the University of Sheffield. But I know that many LSPs are investigating this and working on using this internally because it offers considerable advantages. Now, finally, before we wrap up this section, we want to talk a little bit about the linguists. I've said that they're at the center of things, but I've talked about all this technology, and you may be wondering, okay, what does this really mean for the linguist? Well, the first thing is that linguists need to be trained to work in these environments. They represent a change from the traditional cat tool environment, and not all linguists really like working in this approach. Some want to continue working in a more craft, bespoke sort of environment. And so part of what needs to happen is that LSPs have to identify which linguists take advantage of this so that they can use these, and then they can take those other linguists and use them for things where they add value, such as really bespoke marketing or other content that really needs the human touch more than some of these other things. So these technologies don't take away from linguists who don't use them, but they enable linguists who use them to specialize and become more productive. And as I noted, some linguists report up to 200 to 300% productivity increases with early augmented systems. We've actually heard of even higher productivity increases in certain very specialized scenarios. But as a more general one, by taking off this repetitive work that linguists often have to spend their time with, and by reducing their overhead spent in research and other things, it lets them produce far more. And the advantage for the linguist is that as continued price pressure erodes what's being paid per word, linguists actually can find their income going up because they're able to translate so much more. And for LSPs, it enables them to offer more value to their customers and to provide better turnaround time, and all the other things that their customers are clamoring for. Now, I said that the linguists do see these increases, but as I mentioned, some struggle to use the resources. So those are the ones that will do other things and will actually gain a benefit by allowing them to focus on the kinds of projects they do well in. LSPs will play a vital role in finding and selecting the best linguists for each of these approaches. So they will enable this really to happen. And it's something that in general, a buyer who may say, well, I'd like to go directly to linguists, won't be able to do. So this adds value to the LSPs as well. Now with that, I'm going to move on to the final section where we look at the role of machine translation in particular. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. This is from a report we had called The Calculus of Translation, where we tried to calculate how much content is being generated each day that might be interesting to be translated, that might have value for customers. And we tried to figure out how much is actually being translated. And we ended up with this number here that you see, 0.0000008%. Now, even if we say, well, you don't really want to translate a lot of that, what's clear is that the translation industry today cannot keep up with the demand that is out there for content to be translated. And that's why machine translation is imperative. You can't tell humans to do it all. That's why augmented translation is going to become increasingly important, because the humans will need to know where to focus their efforts and where machine translation will be good enough and solve the need. So let's look a little bit about machine translation in enterprise environments. Until 2016, and that year is very deliberately chosen, MT was still largely an enterprise solution. It was expensive and difficult to maintain. Most enterprises maintained and used both in-house and commercial solutions, such as for different languages or different domains, domain being a particular subject field. But since 2016, enterprise MT adoption has increased dramatically, as has use for LSPs. And the reason for that is the introduction in late 2015 of the first commercial neural machine translation systems, which offered dramatically more readable output and increased the acceptance of this technology. Today, CSA Research conservatively estimates that raw, that is unedited machine translation, generates more than 300 times as much content as all professional human linguists put together. And I say that's conservative because the total's probably much higher. It could be as much as 1,000 times as much. And this in turn has led many enterprises to say, well, why don't we just use machine translation for everything? And there's a lot of reasons. I won't go into all of them here, but this often creates a high risk because machine translation still can go catastrophically wrong, and you need that human intervention to find those problems. It can also delete your brand control and create other problems for you. Now, the challenge of neural machine translation is that quality is rapidly improving, but these increases in fluency, that is how well it reads, can easily hide problems in accuracy, and that creates the situation of risk I mentioned. So raw MT remains suitable primarily for low-risk environments. And anytime you have content that's important for representing your brand or the customer experience, humans are going to remain important for the foreseeable future. A lot of enterprises, though, do have unrealistic expectations for human parity, driven by press releases where large tech companies say they're as good as human translators. I'll just give you a short statement. No, they aren't true. If you look at how they achieve it, what it really means is under very artificial circumstances, using very specific ways of assessing this, they can get scores that meet or exceed human translation. But the moment you roll this out into the real world, that seeming parity completely disappears. Now, translation also requires large amounts of data, and that means that it will continue to require humans. Machine translation requires data. As a colleague of mine from when I worked at the German Research Center for Artificial Intelligence put it, MT is a clever parrot, but it's still a parrot. This means machine translation, even the neural variety, can only repeat back things that it's seen in some form. So the next time somebody says, well, neural machine translation is based on the human brain and it works just like the human brain, don't believe it. It is based on brains, but the sophistication is more like the sophistication of the visual ganglia of a fruit fly than a human brain. There's still a lot that's not understood. And this means that neural machine translation does not understand your content. It can't deal with new uses of language it's never seen. It can't make inferences and do all the other things that a skilled human translator can do. These technologies require ubiquitous data and large amounts of it. So that means humans are going to have to continue to produce translation for the foreseeable future, barring some complete revolution in technology we don't even conceive of yet. Now, the most valuable data in this is how humans interact with machines. How much time are they spending on things? This can help with quality estimation. What and how do they correct problems? This can improve the output. And what information do they need to complete the translation? All this, when fed into an augmented translation system, can improve the MT and the human experience. Another area where MT can help is that often we find that companies are limited in the number of languages they produce by cost. Now, machine translation can serve as a force multiplier and allow them to add more languages. For instance, in the charts on here, which are from a couple of reports we've done, we see that the average automotive company, which is one of the most multilingual sectors, supports 18 languages. A lot of them support one or two, some support 50 or 60, but the average is 18. What this means is that as companies want to add more languages, often they say, well, we can't afford it. But if they can use MT, it will allow them to reach out to that portion of their market that they currently aren't addressing in its own language. And our research shows this is vital for building a good customer experience. And what we see, for instance, here on this chart at left, I won't go into details, but automotive companies, despite being multilingual, actually aren't terribly efficient at reaching global markets. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But this shows that some, like apparel and accessories or online services, the ones over to the right of this line, are much more efficient. But using machine translation and augmented translation should be able to move all these companies over to the right and make them more efficient in meeting their market needs. But MT in isolation is only half a solution. Enterprises need a continuum of services, everything from quick and dirty MT for communicating with customers in service environments where there's no time for human translation, up to very bespoke, highly crafted translation of marketing slogans and things like this. There has been a move in some cases for companies to try and do some of this in-house and outsource some of it. But doing this leads to inefficiency and discontinuity across these channels. It's much better to work with LSPs that can deliver that full continuity of or continuum of service. An additional limitation for organizations that want to deploy MT and think they can do it themselves is that in-house systems typically work for core languages, but development is expensive when you need to move to 30 or 40 languages, whereas an LSP can aggregate those costs and deploy them across multiple customers and thereby make translation cheaper. And they also can integrate it with the augmented translation scenario we've been talking about. So a few words of best practice for MT at enterprises, even if you have an in-house effort. And I don't know how many of you do, but assuming that some of you do, Build connections to specialist providers, the LSPs that know your subject fields and that understand machine translation. The most successful enterprise MT efforts adopt a multi-source strategy. That means even if they're doing something in-house, they're still going to outsource. And if they have to choose between doing it in-house or outsourcing, outsourcing is almost always the better option because it's generally more efficient. And those of you say, yeah, but there's open NMT, there's all these new things that we can do. If you're looking at that, consider that simply implementing an MT toolkit almost always falls below expectations because there's so many other things that companies need to know and that LSPs can provide. You have to gather your data and work with your external partners to use it effectively. This means gather all sorts of multilingual information you have, chat logs, anything that may be relevant will help you move into the future and help your LSPs be more effective in the augmented translation environment because there's more data to draw upon. So work closely with partners to integrate processes and reduce waste in those processes. And with that, I've reached the end. I'm going to go through just a few conclusions and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So the first thing, if you take away just a few points from this, the first point I'd like you to take away is that neither pure machine nor pure human solutions can deliver optimal results. The future really is in hybrid augmented solutions where machines add value to humans and humans do what they do best, freed from all the distracting clutter that has been part of solutions in the past. And that means the future really is in augmented translation, where these combined and integrated services will offer the best results. Work with partners. MT is not a core enterprise competency in most cases, but it is a competency where LSPs can provide tremendous value. So your partners offer flexibility and scalability. And you should certainly learn about MT, and you may want to deploy it in-house in certain cases, such as for support, but often it's better to work with LSPs even for that. And then looking forward, I haven't gone through a lot of this, but as you're looking forward to the augmented future, one of the things that's imperative is for companies to focus on building their internal skills so that they can develop content that is more translatable, useful, and that they have the resources to support this. So this means building terminology, improving authoring, and really scaling up knowledge management so that you have those resources that automated content enrichment can tie to and that augmented translation can draw on more generally. That's where you need to focus. And this will deliver benefit both for translation, but also for internal processes that will be able to work more efficiently from having access to this information. Now, I'll just bring this slide up. This is a list of some of the many reports we have that cover different aspects of this, and that if you're interested in learning more about augmented translation or how content's changing or how technology is changing, these are all reports that we have available. And I actually left out the most important one. We have a report called Augmented Translation that's available free of charge from our website. It goes through all the technologies I talked about, talks about how they're applied, and it's a good report you can go and download so that you understand how these things affect the translation industry and buyers of translation services. And with that, I've reached the end. I'd like to open it up for question and answer and see if any of you have comments. And again, ask me tough questions. Those are going to be the most interesting. Okay.
We did have a bunch of Meryl. I'm scrolling to bring some up on the screen for you. Give me 1 second.
Oh, good.
Here's one. So is the increment of productivity accompanied by the same output quality seen in the traditional workflow, or does this metric suffer?
That's a fantastic question. So what we've seen is that the quality actually tends to go up slightly. Now, defining quality is a whole other topic that we could spend all this time on. But what improves it is the increase in consistency by serving up this information in real time and not requiring the translator to go look for it. When a translator encounters something where they say, I don't know what that is, there's always the temptation to say, I've got to get this job out by 2 p.m. today. I'm just going to go with what I think it is. But with an augmented translation approach, it can bring up what it is so they don't think what it is, they know what it is. The other thing is by freeing up time in general, it lets the translators focus on things where they need attention and they don't feel the same pressure to rush through just to meet a deadline. So it tends to increase quality, if anything. Now, of course, I say that, but the devil's in the details, and there's all sorts of factors that may influence that either way. Hope that answers it.
Thanks. I'll bring up the next one as well. When you say there's a shared pool of data, where is it collected? How about confidentiality?
Okay, thank you. That's an important clarification. When I said shared pool of data, I didn't mean that it was shared across clients, and I realize it could sound exactly like that. What I meant specifically was that the same pool of data is shared between machine translation and translation memory. That could be specific to a client or using anonymization technologies that are coming out that could be shared across clients. But in general, it's best to limit it to a shared pool for an individual client. So yeah, once you start sharing it across clients, it can quickly degrade the output. So thank you for asking for that.
And would you say that proofreaders will take the front seat now?
Huh. I hadn't thought of it in precisely those terms. For some situations, that's probably actually I'd say that's probably accurate for some low-risk situations where the MT is deemed to be good enough, and it's really a matter of somebody just cleaning it up around the edges. But for anything that's high risk, the proofreaders alone won't be able to do it, and it will be the linguists in the center, the translator, and the person with the skill working with all those technologies. But I would say that proofreaders will go up in importance in some cases.
Thank you. Here's another one. Let's see. Is there any free or open source MT for English to French translation aside from the online services like Google and DeepL?
Well, there is. I'm going to have to look at that in more detail because I do know there's a Perdium that comes out of Europe, which provides, I think it covers French, English to French. Then there's also some services like those provided by Modern MT that offer this, but they're often tied in with vendor ecosystems. That's a complex topic. Paul, if you want to email me, I'll probably be able to give you a better answer that way. Okay.
There's a bunch coming in. I'm just trying to sort for some that might be a little bit different. Here's one that seems a little different. Why is augmented translation the future and not now? It exists, so why not faster adoption?
Well, it exists in the sense that if you wanted to look back at, I don't know, the auto industry in 1910, you'd say it existed, but look at what it's become. So it's in a point of transition still between what's been going on and what's coming. A lot of this does exist as Kenneth points out. So that's a good thing to establish. But other things like automated content enrichment, you're hard-pressed to find in any current implementations, even though at CSA Research, we think that actually offers some of the best potential for long-term improvement. And if you look at the industry as a whole, lights out project management, although it's common with large LSPs, still isn't common for small ones. So a lot of this hasn't yet percolated down to what many translators interact with. So it's in the present, but it's more so in the future. And why not faster adoption? It's because a lot of the technology is still being cooked, so to speak, right now. Okay.
Perfect. And we'll do just a few more. When you are talking about leveraging subsegments from the TM, will the calculation of metrics change?
They'll have to, because right now the metrics, I assume you're talking about things like fuzzy match rates and things like this. And those are calculated at the whole segment level. And often they don't reflect the reality of what the translator has to do, where a one-word change actually could mean that the translation has to be rewritten. So if you look at subsegments, metrics can be much more accurate at that level than they can at the whole segment level. But how those will be presented, how that will be handled for costing and pricing purposes is a complex topic. And at present, LSPs still tend to quote whole segment rates just because this is still being figured out. Okay.
So I'm seeing more and more errors in financial post-editing that I proofread. Isn't there a risk that the post-editing is assigned to less qualified people due to the drop in rates? In which case, wouldn't the proofreader's role be made more difficult?
So if it's just a matter of dropping rates and throwing jobs at whoever picks them up, that's absolutely what would happen. The advantage of augmented translation with that lights out project management component I was talking about specifically is that it's able to find who's done the best for this kind of work in the past. There's some difficulties in this around personal data and trust in machines and other things. So this isn't as far along as we might like to see it. But for companies that have deployed this with their talent pools, they're able to find who's going to do the best work with this job based on things they've previously done, which should actually be assigning more qualified people to the work. And if it makes them more productive, even with the drop in rates, if it increases their pay, then they'll want to stick around and do it. So the promise is that actually it should improve in this area. But of course, this assumes people do things right. And if they do it wrong, there is a risk of this. Okay.
All right, and we'll do one more. I'm bringing it up now. When it comes to low resource languages like Indian languages, MT doesn't work so well. Sometimes it produces funny and absurd output. Do you think this issue can be solved if linguists are more involved?
To some extent. One of the challenges, so there's two linked issues here. One is that low resource languages just don't have the data that's needed. And Indic languages are a great example. So the training data isn't there and you get weird results. But the other one that pops up is the greater the distance between two cultures and two languages, the harder MT has to work. So if you think about going from, say, Spanish to Portuguese, MT can be fantastically good because, yeah, there's some differences, but the languages are very similar, so it doesn't have to deal with differences in structure. The concept systems are somewhat shared, and they can do a really good job. Now, if you go from English to, I don't know, Telugu, a lot of that shared structure and shared conceptual system goes away, and so MT simply becomes harder. And then if you go from English to Japanese, it becomes yet harder because you've moved out of the sort of this Indo-European influenced world that's in India. You go to Japan and it gets harder. So this actually becomes, this is an ongoing challenge. If linguists are more involved, the idea is that it iteratively gets better and improves things. So yeah, I would think if the big names were hiring people who actually cared about different languages and brought them in, it would lead to improvement. A lot of MT researchers today aren't linguists. They don't actually care about language. They see it as a big data problem. So the key would be to get linguists in. Okay, and with that, I think we're out of time. Becky, if you can send me the questions that have accumulated, I will try and answer some of them and see about providing a document back with short answers to some of them.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Arl. We did have some other ones come in just now, so I'll be in touch soon. Thanks to everyone for joining us today and for this great presentation.
Okay, thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.